Whenever people ask me about my dad growing up, I would quote Cher Howitz from Clueless. My dad's a litigator. That's the scariest type of lawyer. The law, it was passed down in my family like a hideous heirloom. My father was a lawyer, my uncle was a lawyer, my grandfather was a lawyer, and it wasn't just my family. In fact, most of the people I grew up around had families full of lawyers. But you'll note one thing in common among all of these lawyers I've told you about: a Y chromosome. But despite my 2 X chromosomes, the idea that I would someday become a lawyer always felt inevitable. I don't recall being interested in the law, but being a lawyer always felt like a vehicle to respect. Psychotherapist Amy Morin explains on September 22nd, 2020, the dangers of high expectations placed on children during crucial adolescent years. She explains the pressure to perform and to succeed, especially to live up to a parent's successes, can be damaging to their own identity formation. Not only does it internalize the feeling that they're not good enough, but it also leaves them wondering who they are and what is important to them. Anna Dorn, author of Bad Lawyer, is the daughter of an extremely successful Washington, D.C. lawyer. Anna reluctantly goes to law school in hopes of living up to her family's expectations, but struggles with her profession and identity being coherent with one another, fearing a broken justice system that blocks out any good. Bad Lawyer by Anna Dorn. My dad was a good lawyer. He wasn't a good person, per se, but he was a good lawyer. He was successful. A top-notch international trade litigator. And Cher was right. Litigators are scary. My dad was scary. Scary when he was mad, and even scarier when he wasn't. But though I'd often quote Clueless, my favorite movie was actually Liar Liar. A successful lawyer who frequently breaks promises to his child and is not able to lie. The metaphor? It's not subtle. Because when I was 4, my mom asked me if I thought my dad would remember my birthday. He didn't. And then 12, I ran through some glass doors and landed up in the ER. I called my dad to let him know, and he said, "I have a meeting." Then hung up. 17, some bold friends of mine asked me if I really even had a dad. I'm still not totally sure I do. And then there's 27. My dad invited me out for sushi after work one day at the sushi restaurant that we always go to without my mom. My mom and dad, they're not divorced, which is perplexing to anyone who has actually spent time in a room with them. Mom told me he stumbled. Normally at these dinners, I talk about myself and then he talks about himself, and neither of us really listen to what the other one is saying. She told me you were dating someone? Yeah. I was dating a woman for the first time, a fact I hadn't told either of my parents yet. I was fiercely resistant on the idea that gay people must come out. It's unfair to impose that burden on an already marginalized group. I wasn't hiding anything actively from my dad, but I wasn't going to start making announcements either. Announcements are tacky, not my style. I took another sip of my beer because I was terrified that this was going to get cheesy. You know, King and Spalding, they were voted one of the best law firms to work at for gays and lesbians. My dad's response was so misguided that I actually had to appreciate it. He had responded to the fact that I was a lesbian with a statistic, with evidence, as though that was moral support. It was classic. Classic attorney, classic my dad. My father actually had to hire a psychiatrist to prepare him for retirement, something that he had talked about for 10 years before actually biting the bullet. To his credit, it did make him easier to be around. It felt like for the first time ever, he was actually listening when I spoke, but it didn't fix the underlying problem, that my dad ultimately cared more about being respected than anything else. Growing up, people always said that my dad and I were similar, a comparison that deeply offended me. I guess we're both disciplined and self-absorbed, depressive and insecure. Early on, I promised myself that I would grow up to be nothing like him. I would fight my genetic codings and the frequent suggestions that I should become a lawyer just like my father. I didn't care about money or status, I told myself. In high school, I became a Marxist. I stopped buying clothes and eating meat. I meditated to become less argumentative. My mantra was tranquil. I wore hemp necklaces, and I spent most of my time in the dark room listening to Usher and getting high off Photographic Fixer, and suddenly flowers appeared on blank paper. You know, typical white girl shit. But then I had to start thinking about a job. I didn't want a job. I wanted to keep going to school, writing papers, and reading books that had utterly nothing to do about the practical realities of life. I didn't want to sell myself or sell things to the brainwashed masses. I was a Marxist. But my Floridian grandmother wanted nothing more than to have a granddaughter in law school. She would even pay my tuition. I would go to law school and it would be paid for. This was huge because the exorbitant cost of getting a law degree is the major obstacle to getting a law degree. You can go into school wanting to save the planet, but debt eventually forces you to defend corporations accused of child poisoning. But because I was going gratis, I could be a good lawyer, the kind that defends vulnerable populations and people who are wrongly accused of crimes. Or that's what I told myself. I didn't have to be like my dad. I could change the world. When he found out I was writing this book, he said he was going to write a rebuttal to my book called Good Lawyer. I responded, based on what? Well, my experience as a lawyer, he said. Dad, are you honestly proud of your law career? Well, yes. I'm very proud of what I've done in my law career. To be clear, being a lawyer was never my dream. It was a profession pushed on to me by my parents, by society, teachers, whatever. Bad lawyer doesn't mean my own badness, but rather the badness of the system. This could not be my fate. I needed agency. I needed to be somebody. But I was endeared to the idea of being right. So I became a bad lawyer.